I got interested in some Irishmen that were fighting there during the Battle of Galveston on the artillery side. Blockade running was a big thing here in Galveston. I knew that a Civil War battle, an important battle, had taken place here in 1863. I would say, you're not going to believe this, but this is where Juneteenth actually originated. I had a lot of people on my tours that would say, June what? They had never heard of it.
Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. This episode comes from the Rosenberg Library Conversation series, where I sat down with a few historians to talk about some extremely interesting historical facts about Galveston and Texas history. I would like to personally thank the Rosenberg Library for allowing Galveston Unscripted to hold live podcast conversations in the library. This conversation series was such a great experience, and I really look forward to picking it up again in the fall of 2023. And a very huge thank you to our guests. Now, this episode with Mr. Ed Cotham is about an hour long, but trust me, you are going to want to stick around and listen through the entire thing. We discuss the Civil War in Texas and the Battle of Galveston, and some other historical aspects of the 1860s here in Texas. Check the link in the description for the direct links to the books that our guest has written. If this is your first time listening to Galveston Unscripted, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. If you've listened or watched before and you enjoy the content we are putting out in audio and video, please make sure to like, subscribe, and review the podcast. Leave us a review, leave us a rating. It really helps other people find what we are doing here at Galveston Unscripted. Your rating and review helps other people find Galveston Unscripted and discover the amazing history of our little island. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all those social media platforms. Without further ado, let's hop into this episode with Mr. Ed Cotham. Hi everybody, if you guys don't know me, my name is JR. I started Galveston Unscripted, a podcast about, it was July of 2021, and I started it in my closet and started building audio guides that paired with my running tour. So I started recording these audio guides and then started interviewing people, and it's just kind of grown and expanded, and I am so honored to be able to sit here at the Rosenberg Library and sit with people like Ed and discuss our city and Texas and how the island that we live on is just such an important piece of history in this state and in this country. So thank y'all so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Well, without any further ado, I just want to introduce our guest this evening, Mr. Ed Cotham. You have a pretty long bio here, so I'm just going to hit the highlights, all right? So Ed retired in 2023 as the Chief Investment Officer of the Terry Foundation in Houston. The Terry Foundation is the largest private source of scholarships at Texas universities. Ed holds an undergraduate degree in economics from the University of Houston and a master's degree in economics from the University of Chicago. Ed returned to Texas to obtain a law degree from the University of Texas. Ed is a former president of the Houston Civil War Roundtable and is active in the Civil War preservation movement. In 2011, Ed received the President's Award for Distinguished Volunteer Service from the Galveston Historical Foundation. He is a life member of the Civil War Preservation Trust. He has plenty of Civil War awards and awards from all over the country. So I'm just going to list off a few of his books here. His published works include Battle on the Bay, The Civil War Struggle for Galveston, which we will discuss a little bit about today. Sabine Pass, The Confederacy's Thermopylae. The Southern Journey of a Civil War Marine, The Illustrated Notebook of Henry O. Gusley. A Busy Week in Texas, Ulysses S. Grant's 1880 Visit to the Lone Star State. And Juneteenth, The Story Behind the Celebration. All right, so am I missing anything, Ed?
I don't think so.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so Ed, he's been on my podcast before, and we discussed the Battle of Galveston, and I really wanted to dive into a little bit of Ed's background and how he got into Civil War history in the first place. So, Ed, could you tell us how you got into Civil War history and how you got into Galveston history?
Sure, JR. I'm delighted to be here this evening to talk with you about one of my favorite subjects, which is Civil War things connected with Galveston. I got interested in the Civil War very early, and I can remember my mother taking me particularly to the Vicksburg battlefield, because we had some family over that way early on in life. And I got really interested in Civil War history in that connection. But, you know, coming back to Texas, we didn't have much in the way of Civil War battlefields that you could visit, at least at that time. And I didn't really keep that interest as fresh as I could until I got to college. And then I got hooked on a couple of books, particularly Bruce Catton's history of the Civil War, and got back into it. And then eventually I started wondering what happened in Texas during the Civil War. And my wife and I had a weekend place down here in Galveston. And so I actually came here to the Rosenberg Library at the time, and I went up to the Galveston, Texas History Center, which I will say without reservation is one of the great archives in the United States to research anything connected with history. And I was up there, and I went up to one of the archivists at the time, and I said, I'd like to see the book on the Battle of Galveston, because I knew that a Civil War battle, an important battle, had taken place here in January of 1863. And the archivist at that time said, well, hate to tell you, but there's not really one. And I said, there's not one. That's hard to imagine. And I kept waiting, figuring that somebody out there had to be writing a book on this important battle. Well, 5 years went by, and nobody did. And I finally said, you know, this is interesting enough. I'm just going to do this. And so it took me 5 years to research and write my first book, which was on the Battle of Galveston. The University of Texas Press was kind enough to actually publish that book, and I got hooked on it. And it's the way this works, and I know there are a number of authors here in the room that will tell you the same thing. When you're working on a project like that, you see something interesting. And in the case of the Battle of Galveston, I got interested in some little Irishmen that were fighting there during the Battle of Galveston on the artillery side. And I knew that they had something to do with the Battle of Sabine Pass, so I followed them over and wrote a book on the Battle of Sabine Pass. And while I was writing the book on the Battle of Sabine Pass, I got interested in the ships that were used by the Union in that battle and the Battle of Galveston. So I followed that out to the southern journey of a Civil War Marine, and it's kind of snowballed since then. And as many of you know, I've gotten to where I give a lot of tours of Civil War Galveston, particularly around the battle's anniversary at the beginning of January of 1863. And as I would lead people around this city, it always struck me that there were some things that I would point to that didn't have historic markers to do with it, and nobody had ever really covered. And in particular, I remember going by this lot at the corner of 22nd and Strand, and I would point to the parking lot and say, something incredibly important happened on this site of this parking lot. And I would say, you're not going to believe this, but this is where Juneteenth actually originated. And people at the time, now I've been doing this for close to 40 years, I would give these tours. And back in the early days, I had a lot of people on my tours that would say, June what? They had never heard of it. And then I would get people that they would say, you mean that thing that happened where they have like barbecues and parades and stuff? And I would say, yeah, but it has a whole lot more to do with it than that. That's not really the story at all. And I kind of kept waiting for somebody to write a book that really covered what actually happened in Galveston on June 19th of 1865. And kind of like my first book, nobody really did. And so I finally got up the nerve to actually write that book. And it came out, and JR, you know this, it came out, and this was absolute dumb luck, but it came out, and then 3 weeks later, they declared it a national holiday. So, you know, that's kind of one of those things you can't predict. And I've been threatening to write a book on Arbor Day just to kind of cover the rest of the holidays. But as you can see, I've gotten really interested in Galveston and Texas history in the Civil War and kind of followed that thread all through my work.
All right, that's great. So I would like to take a high-level view of Texas entering the Civil War and the decisions behind Texas entering the Civil War and hone in on Galveston. So could you give us a brief overview of, I guess, the decision for Texas to enter the Civil War?
Sure. I mean, Texas is the 7th state to join the Confederacy. So Texas is by no means the first to do that. South Carolina, of course, comes out of the gate swinging very heavy. And Texas took kind of a measured approach. And I think in large part, that was due to the leadership in Texas at that time, and in particular, Sam Houston. Sam Houston did not at all favor secession. He was really opposed to that. And he fought that as long and as hard as he could. He delayed having a secession convention like everywhere else, and when it came, he saw to it with some people there that instead of Texas just voting to leave at a convention, that they put it up to a popular vote, and all that kind of delayed Texas leaving the Union and going in favor of the South. And there was also a question, it was not just a question of whether Texas would leave the Union, there was also the question of what Texas would leave the Union for. Because we'd been a republic. The Republic of Texas was still an option. And I think maybe Sam Houston, in the back of his mind, still had some sort of idea that if Texas left the Union, maybe they would go back into a republic or something, that they didn't need to join the rest of the Cotton South at that time. And so that was very delayed and finally happened, but we did have this vote. The interesting thing to me about the way that we left the Union was, if you look at the vote, now it's very heavily in favor of secession most places, although there are some counties, particularly where there are large German population or immigrant populations, where secession did not pass a lot. Galveston was not one of those places. Galveston voted heavily in favor of secession. And at first you kind of wonder, what were those people thinking? Because Galveston was the largest port in Texas, growing at the rate of 50% per year. It was an insane place to be commercially at the outset before the war began. And almost as soon as the war began, of course, the Union blockades Galveston, and so Galveston ends up being commercially hurt worse than any other place in the state during the balance of the Civil War. So it didn't work out for Galveston very well, at least during the war. But that's sort of the whole operation throughout the war, is everybody trying to find their place in it. And I think that Texas is slow to join the Confederacy, but they're very enthusiastic when they do. And if you look at the number of troops that Texas provided as a percentage of the adult white population, it's very, very high and compares with anywhere else in the Confederacy.
So you mentioned that Galveston was economically hurt by entering the Civil War, and so I know Galveston was blockaded by the Union, and Galveston. And one question I get very often is about the blockade runners here leaving Galveston and running that cotton out of the port of Galveston. Could you tell us a little bit about blockade runners, and if you know any of the tactics that they used?
Sure. Blockade running was a big thing here in Galveston. And think about it this way. At the end of the Civil War, Galveston was the last major Confederate port anywhere in the Confederate States. And so as the war went on and the Union blockade became more and more effective elsewhere in the Confederacy, in places like New Orleans are captured, and eventually Mobile is captured, and Savannah is captured, and places like that, the number of available ports for the Confederacy to get things out, and in particular cotton, to get cotton out to some of these places and trade that for high luxury goods or weapons, it becomes increasingly restricted. And so blockade running at the outset of the war in Galveston was easy, frankly. They didn't have many ships that were dedicated down here. The ships that were dedicated to the Galveston blockade were relatively old and ineffective, and almost anybody could run the blockade at the beginning of the war. As the blockade intensified and became more concentrated off the entrance to Galveston Bay, the Galveston blockade runners had to get more sophisticated as well. And so we started having a number of ships that were purpose-built to run the blockade. Usually they were built in England or somewhere abroad. And these things were steamers, but they were very low in the water, long kind of cigar-shaped things with very little relief above the water, and they were painted gray so they wouldn't stand out to the Union blockade ships. They would pile those ships as high as they could with cotton, And in Galveston, the way they did it was they went to the top of a building, a high building, and the building almost universally chosen was one that still stands today, the Henley Building, at the corner of 20th and Strand. And the blockade runner captains would wait until there was a particularly advantageous night, usually when it was hazy, maybe stormy, that sort of thing, maybe foggy, as we get from time to time. They'd wait for those nights. And then just before it got dark, they'd run to the roof of the Henley Building and they'd sketch where all these Union blockading ships were on a map. And they'd figure out it's like football. You're running where there's no defense, right? And so they would run down just as it was getting dark, jump onto their ship. They'd already have the steam ready, and they'd paddle out and run out of Galveston Harbor. And running out of Galveston Harbor with that kind of preparation was enormously successful. I think at least 90% of the ships running out of Galveston were successful, probably for almost the entire course of the war. We have a number of blockade runner wrecks around Galveston, but most of those are not people going out. They're people coming in. Because again, if you're coming into Galveston, you had a whole different approach. You couldn't go to the top of the Henley Building and figure out where everybody was. What you had to do was probably wait until it was just about dawn and then find a place where you kind of squeeze in closer to the coast than the Union blockaders and sneak into one of the channels. And a lot of these blockade runner captains didn't have a whole lot of familiarity with Galveston waters, and they're really treacherous to begin with. So kind of squeezing into some of those channels, coming in closer to the shore, meant that some of these ran aground, and particularly like one like the Denby ran aground not too far from where the jetty is today. And that was a tricky operation, and that's where the blockade kind of failed sometimes and resulted in these wrecks. But keep in mind, this was enormously profitable. If you could run out of the blockade in Galveston, probably going out one way and coming back with a cargo, you would probably pay for your entire ship on that one voyage. And it was enormously profitable to do this. So that's why, as the war went on, more and more blockade runners were coming into Galveston. And by 1864, frankly, the accounts of the newspapers say that anything that could float then was basically being used to paddle out to sea and take cotton as far as they could get it and take it to a place where they could sell it. Now, some of the traffic went overland into Mexico, but a lot of it came out of Galveston on these blockade runners, and not just Galveston. It was also the case at Sabine Pass, Matagorda Bay, and a number of other places. But Galveston was the center of blockade running here.
Okay, so let's get into it. October of 1862, the Union Navy sails into Galveston without a fight, and they're docked along Galveston from October to December 31st, 1862. What goes on? Well, I'm just gonna let you go with that one. Can we hop right into the Battle of Galveston and the events leading up to?
So as you say, Galveston was basically surrendered to the Union in October of 1862 without a fight. They fire one gun and then retreat to the mainland because the general in charge of Texas at the time was a guy named Paul Octave Hebert, who was a former governor of Louisiana, West Pointer. He looked at a map and said, there's no way to defend an island. That's just silly. If we're going to defend this place, we just need to defend it on the mainland. And ultimately, he built a big fort over there, kind of where the causeway reaches the mainland today, and that was called Fort Hebert in his honor. But in the fall of 1862, the Confederate leadership in Richmond responds to the people of Texas who are just infuriated by this decision to abandon Galveston Island, and they send down here a very unique individual, General John Bankhead Magruder, known as Prince John in the old Army. And Magruder was probably the most unconventional general of the entire Civil War. And he gets down here and decides that not only is he going to try to recapture the city of Galveston, but he's going to do it almost immediately. So he gets to Houston in November of 1862, and he launches one of the wildest battle plans of the entire Civil War on New Year's Eve between December 31st of 1862, January 1st of 1863. And it's going to have all kinds of wild elements. He's going to sneak guns over from mainland over the railroad bridge, take them to the waterfront and fire them out at the ships in the harbor. Then he's going to have a wading charge against some of the Union troops that are on a wharf. And then he's going to have some improvised gunboats that he's made out of cotton steamboats coming from Houston. Then he loads up with big bales of cotton. And all this is going to happen in the middle of the night. And almost all of it goes dead wrong. I mean, you could not imagine a plan going absolutely worse. But in the end, he gets absolutely dumb lucky, and the Union does some things that are even stupider. And so at the end of the evening, the federal warship that's in charge of Galveston, that's under the command of Commodore William B. Renshaw, managed to run itself aground out there on Pelican Spit, in the middle of Galveston Harbor, and they decide they have to blow it up to keep it out of Confederate hands. They set the explosives and blow it up, but it blows up too soon and kills Commodore Renshaw and his entire crew on that boat. And so what's left of the Union fleet kind of limps out of Galveston Harbor, and the wildest battle plan of the Civil War that went wrong almost from the beginning ends up succeeding. And so Galveston becomes the only major port city that the Union ever captured, and then the Confederates recaptured from the Union. It becomes one of the shining success stories of the Confederacy. And then they decide they're going to put defenses around the island and put fortifications around the island, and Galveston will last all the way until June of 1865, and Galveston will become the last major port. And Texas will end up being the most successfully defended Confederate states. And it's really a remarkable achievement given how little the Confederacy had to work with here.
So one thing that I know interests a lot of my listeners and people I talk to pretty often are the cotton clads. And when I explain to them about how they stacked compressed cotton around these cotton clads and how that was maybe not enough armor, but it was armor nonetheless, they're shocked that that was even done or even used. Could you tell us a little bit about the cotton clads, the process, the thinking, and the recruiting for the cotton clads?
Sure. Well, keep in mind, I mentioned General Magruder. General Magruder was in charge of the Confederate Army on the peninsula leading up to Richmond in 1862. So he is there when the ironclad Monitor and the ironclad Virginia fight there at Hampton Roads, and he watches that whole thing with these ironclads. Now, he's going to come down to Texas, and, he'd like to build some ironclads himself, but we don't have enough iron around here to really do that, and he doesn't have the operation to do that. So he looks around and says, what do we have a lot of? And it turns out that they have a whole bunch of cotton sitting here that can't get out and waiting for, an exit strategy on blockade runners, etc. And so he says, maybe we can use this cotton as the armament for our ships. And so they'll take two big river steamers, the Bayou City and the Neptune No. 2, and they will put these cotton bales all along the upper structures of these vessels to provide some armament, and in particular for the men that are behind that armament, because Magruder expects that coming down in the middle of the night to attack the Union fleet, he's not probably going to be able to disable those ships with the few cannon that are on these ships. He's going to actually have to run into them and send over boarding parties. So he finds some men up kind of near College Station, frankly, and they're part of the Sibley Brigade. And these men are dismounted cavalry troops, and he asks if they will participate and become part of the boarding parties on these two Confederate cotton-clad ships. And they say they will. And so General Tom Green agrees to have them do this. And so they will become known in Galveston lore as the Horse Marines, because they were cavalrymen that were serving as Marines on board these cotton-clad ships. The interesting part about that is when you trace down where these men came from, a lot of them were German troops that spoke very little English up from the hill country. And if you look at it, look at the accounts of these men, when they volunteered to serve on board these cotton clads, Many of these men had never been on a ship before, and the accounts say that some of these men had never even seen a ship before. So they had a very interesting service as Marines in the middle of the night on board these cotton clads. I might also mention, when we're talking about cotton armor, one of the really unique things about the Battle of Galveston is the use of cotton artillery, because General Magruder was not only interested in using cotton on board these steamships, he also had brought down a very large naval gun, a Dahlgren, on a railroad car, and they brought that over to the city of Galveston, kind of near where the Railroad Museum is today. And they brought that over, and it was armored with cotton bales. And he had done the same thing in Virginia at a battle called Savage's Station, but he'd used iron on that occasion with railroad iron, and they called that railroad car with the iron the Land Merrimack, because it was kind of an ironclad thing. But he did that again in Galveston, armored with cotton. What's interesting about that is that in Virginia was the very first rail-mounted artillery that had ever been used in battle, and the Battle of Galveston is only the second time in history that configuration was used. And as I'm sure we'll talk about later, that's sort of the precursor to some other technology that Magruder and his people were experimenting with here down in Texas.
All right, so I definitely want to cover, towards the end of this, I want to cover Juneteenth and some of the other things you're working on. So to kind of tie up the Battle of Galveston, one story that you told me that's very, very moving is the Edward and Albert Lee story. Could you tell us that story and kind of, bring in all the details and paint us a picture of what that would have been like?
So you always hear the stories about the Civil War that, father fought against son or brother fought against brother and everything, but usually you don't actually hear cases of where that actually happened. But we have a documented case of that here in Galveston. And what happened was this. When John Magruder was getting ready to launch his battle plan here at Texas, there were a number of officers down in the area that volunteered to serve on his staff. And one of the officers who volunteered to serve was a man named Albert Lee, L-E-A. And Albert Lee had been at West Point with Magruder. Magruder knew him very well. He was a very experienced man. And so during the Battle of Galveston, Albert Lee was kind of his eyes and ears, and in particular, he went to the top of one of the tall buildings near Magruder's headquarters. Magruder's headquarters were where the Seeley Mansion is today, basically at 25th and Broadway, about a block from here. And the tall building that Lee went up on to spy what was happening during the battle was almost certainly the building that we call Ashton Villa today. But Lee is watching the battle develop. And at the end of the battle, one of the pivotal moments is when these Confederate cottonclads ram and seize control of a Union ship called the Harriet Lane, which was probably the best ship in Galveston Harbor on that day. Now, unbeknownst to Albert Lee, the first officer on board the Union ship Harriet Lane was his son, Edward Lee. And they had not spoken since before the war because they were pretty well estranged by, as you can imagine, by the oncoming of the war. But this was a battle in which father literally fought against son, the Confederates versus the Union. At the conclusion of the battle, Albert hurries over to the waterfront because he knows his son was on probably one of these ships. He's rowed out to the Harriet Lane, goes on board it, and finds his son mortally wounded on the deck of that vessel. He runs over, the two are briefly reunited, and Albert goes away trying to find some medical attention to try and help his boy. And he leaves. And as he's gone, the surgeons, which is both the Confederate and the Union surgeon by this point, keep going over to the young officer and saying, Edward Lee, is there anything we can do? Is there anything we can do to help you? And Edward keeps asserting over and over again, no, my father is here. My father is here. He will die in that battle. And the next day, a remarkable thing happens over in the cemetery complex that you see today over on Broadway. It's in the Trinity Episcopal Cemetery there, kind of in the southeast portion of that cemetery complex. And what they do is they decide to bury Edward Lee and his captain, Jonathan Mayhew Wainwright. They're going to bury them both at a ceremony. And it's remarkable because they assemble the Union prisoners that they have, quite a few of them, Massachusetts troops, and they assemble those Union prisoners and the Confederates in the area, and then Albert Lee reads the Episcopal burial service over the grave of his son. And Jonathan Wainwright was a Mason, so the local Masons say that since he was a Mason, we're going to bury him with Masonic honors. And so there's a Masonic ceremony with the Confederate reading the burial service over his son. And it's a very respectful thing where people just came together on one occasion and honored somebody who had made the sacrifice of their life. And the neat thing about that is, if you go there today, there's just a little burial marker. It's a very simple thing. It says Edward Lee, killed January 1, 1863, Galveston. And it has a little broken anchor on the top of it, and it says down at the bottom, "My father is here." And to me, that may be the best Civil War marker, a monument I could ever think of, because of the story behind it and the story of reconciliation that kind of starts there the day after the Battle of Galveston. And it's kind of still something we're all coming to grips with today.
Before we move on to Juneteenth and coming into that entire story here in Galveston, is there anything else you would like to cover that I may have missed to ask you about the Battle of Galveston that you particularly like to let people know about?
No, I think the interesting thing is there are very few battles where the Confederates have joint operations, where you have a land part and a sea part. And when you consider the General Magruder came down here from Virginia with absolutely nothing, to in a month put together an assault that involves artillery pieces, soldiers, and improvised gunboats, and then have it work, has to be one of the wildest stories of the entire Civil War. And usually, I've given this talk all across the country now, and when I'm up in a place like Chicago, I usually preface it by saying, I'm going to tell you about the Battle of Galveston. It's the wildest thing in the entire Civil War. And I can see these audiences kind of leaning back and say, oh, okay, yeah. And then I've had many people come up afterwards and say, you told that story, and that was the wildest battle of the Civil War. And, it's just kind of remarkable we have that kind of thing here, and it's worth a lot of study, I think.
Okay, so we are nearing the end of the Civil War. We're in June of 1865. What is it like here in Galveston, and can you tell us what is about to happen? What is coming up?
Okay, again, Galveston is the last major Confederate port anywhere, and it's really, Texas is going to be the last major state to surrender of the war. And so everybody could kind of see what is going to happen, but nobody really knows what is going to happen in terms of how this transition is going to work. And it's worked out very poorly all around the South, because the end of the war doesn't come with any kind of negotiated settlement. There won't be any kind of arrangement for how the transition is going to happen between a brand new government. There's no transition between, again, particularly slavery and emancipation, and who's going to take care of these people and what's going to happen to them, how all that's going to be happening. General Grant and Lee basically kind of cut the framework for what's going to happen with these giant Confederate armies. There's not going to be any negotiation between governments. General Grant was just going to say, all right, you can go home and you can take a few pieces of property with you, but you just go home and that's it. Nothing's ever negotiated. And so as we get closer to the end of the war for Galveston, we're going to be sort of the last bastion of the Confederacy down here. And by my count, there are, by this point, well over 250,000 enslaved people in Texas. And Texas is not like the other Confederate states. In the other Confederate states, you've had Union armies marching back and forth through them all the time. And so a lot of the enslaved people get freed incidentally as part of that, or escape, that sort of thing. That does not happen in Texas. So you have Texas having the last large pocket of enslaved individuals in the entire Confederacy, and nobody is quite sure how that's going to work out. And Galveston in particular, as the end approaches, it becomes incredibly chaotic. The people of Galveston kind of start returning to the city as they can kind of start getting ready to resume the operation of the city. They come back to find their city devastated, so you've got people trying to rebuild. You've got crime everywhere. I mean, the law and order is just completely out of hand down here. In addition to that, you have prisoners that are being returned on a daily basis, large numbers of people, including the main force of Hood's Texas Brigade come in almost the day before Juneteenth. You have hordes of people coming into the state in addition to large groups of federal troops. So Galveston, which was never really set up for this kind of population, is suddenly just beset with this entire population of people. And into this gigantic mess of chaos, they are going to send Major General Gordon Granger and his staff, and he's going to arrive on the morning of June 19th, 1865, with some very specific instructions about what to do.
Well, I'm just going to pass this right back to you. So
All right.
What were those specific instructions?
So this is a detective story that I went through in writing the book on Juneteenth, because I don't know if you've done this like I have, but every June 19th in the newspaper, they would put a story in there about what happened in Galveston on June 19th. And it usually would say something like, General Granger went on the top of a balcony and read an order and told everybody that they were free, and that was Juneteenth. And the order that they would quote, it would just have one sentence, that all slaves are free. And I thought, that sounds odd. I wonder what the rest of that order says. So I actually looked up the original order and read it. It consists of 4 sentences, the first of which does say, in accordance with Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, all slaves are free. The third and fourth sentence, I'll talk about the second in a moment. The third and fourth sentence says, okay, even though you're free, we want you to stay right where you are and keep working for the same old people for now. We'll get back to you. This freedom thing, we'll get back to you, but right now, stay exactly where you are, keep doing what you're doing. And I said, okay, now I know why they don't put the rest of that order in the newspaper, because it's really kind of insulting if you look at it in modern terms. And then you go to the second sentence of that order, and the second sentence of the order is incredibly beautiful. It says, freedom means absolute equality, and absolute equality means a complete, equality between people of all, it's a definition of what absolute equality means. And I said, boy, this does not sound like it was written by the same person, because you've got this boilerplate thing about freedom at the first, these insulting 2 sentences at the end, and this beautiful thing in the middle. And so, again, I worked on this for 40 years, and when I finally figured it all out, what happened was, over in Louisiana, they had the same problem that we were fixing to have. They sent a general up to Shreveport to take over from the Confederates up there, and Shreveport was a complete mess. They'd had flooding, their crops were failing, and they had huge numbers of enslaved people who now learned they were free, and they were coming to the city, and they were talking to the people from the army that had arrived and saying, well, now that you've freed me, now you've got to feed me. And they didn't have the supplies to do that. So it was a complete humanitarian crisis up there in Louisiana. And so a general named Francis Herron decided, I don't know what to do, but what we've got to do is tell these people to go home and stay where they are. And so he issued this order saying, you got to go home and stay where you are. And that order was given, a copy of that order was given to General Sheridan, Phil Sheridan, who was coming down to New Orleans to take over the entire operation down in this part of the South. And General Sheridan didn't like what Herron had done, but he knew there was really no alternative. And so he gave that order to General Granger and his staff and said, when you get to Galveston, basically issue an order telling them that all slaves are free, but telling them that they've got to stay where they are for the time being. So when Granger comes over to Galveston, that order is almost a dead match for what General Sheridan told him to issue, which was based on what had happened to Louisiana. So what about that second sentence, the thing about absolute equality, which again is beautiful. No other order in the entire end of the war is like that. It's very unique. Where does that come from? It always bothered me. And then one day I just got one of those moments, kind of like Homer Simpson, dull, where I realized General Granger didn't even sign the Juneteenth order. When you get the original, which I did, and look at it, he didn't even sign the order. This was signed by one of his staff officers, a man named Frederick W. Emory. And when I looked up Frederick W. Emory and researched him, I think I was probably the first person to figure this out. Emory was a very unique individual. He'd been a newspaper editor of an abolitionist newspaper in Kansas before the war. He'd actually come from the Northeast, from somewhere up in New England. But he settled in Kansas, become an abolitionist newspaper editor. He'd been a member of the legislature there. He joined the 7th Kansas, which was a cavalry regiment. And his commanding officer, you know who his commanding officer was? It was the son of John Brown, the martyr. And these guys, this company that he joined was hardcore abolitionists. These people would have meetings, and at the end, they would sing the John Brown song and vow to avenge him. So this guy was really anti-slavery. And just by a chance, he ended up on General Granger's staff at the end of the war. And I'm sure he got handed this order from General Sheridan and say this when you get there. And he put the first sentence and the last two sentences there. And he said, nobody told me what to put in the middle of this. And he kind of used his editorial discretion and put that beautiful sentence in there. And to us modern people, that's the only thing in the Juneteenth order that really resonates and speaks to us today. So if you go down to the Strand and see that beautiful mural there at 22nd and Strand, where I used to show people there's a parking lot and nothing else, now you've got the Juneteenth mural there. And what's the name of that mural? Absolute Equality. And it has that beautiful sentence from the Juneteenth order that was inserted by this very young staff officer on General Granger's staff. And I don't know that General Granger ever even saw that order. There's no indication that he did. He certainly didn't sign it. But Major Emory did. And we end up having the basis for a national holiday in this order that, just because of the way it was written and the way it was issued, got read to lots of people, got lots of attention, and ended up being celebrated in a kind of a strange way. But to me, it's appropriate that the war ends with something that has such a beautiful resonating phrase to it. I'm glad we could celebrate it here.
Definitely going to leave time for questions at the end. So we've got a few minutes left. So I want to move on to some of your projects that you are working on now. Are you working on anything now? Because I know you've got a handful of books and you're always doing something. I want to hear about what you got going on.
Okay, I'll tell you this. I'll tell you kind of a spoiler thing for what I'm doing now. It's probably the wildest book I've ever written. The working title of this book is called Rockets, Tanks, and Submarines, the story about the Confederate innovations in Texas, because you may be surprised to learn that Texans actually experimented during the Civil War with rockets. And we actually had a dedicated rocket corps that functioned down here in between Galveston and Houston. And this is 100 years before the Johnson Space Center comes to Texas. Now, it didn't work out very well, but they were certainly experimenting with rockets. Tanks. I mentioned tanks earlier on. General Magruder was working with, he had the Land Merrimack up in Virginia. He experimented with a cotton railroad gun at the Battle of Galveston. He didn't stop there. At the end of the war, we have records that they were actually working on what was called a turret car, which would have been railroad iron armored on wheels, and it would have had a turret like the USS Monitor with a gun that could point in any direction. If you start thinking about that, what is an armored turret-mounted gun on wheels? It's one of the prototypes of the tank. So we were actually experimenting with that thing during the Civil War. And the last thing, submarines. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but you probably heard of the submarine H.L. Hunley that was the first ship in military history to sink an enemy vessel in combat. That was in Charleston Harbor in February of 1864. You know who built the Hunley? The ownership of the Hunley was made up of three parties. 2/3 of those were Texans, and particularly people from Port Lavaca at the time. And those guys helped build the Hunley, helped crew the Hunley, and they didn't stop there. They were actually building submarines all the way through the end of the Civil War. And we had 2 torpedo boats, which are kind of submersibles, that were being built in Texas at the end of the war. And we had 1, honest to goodness, submarine, which was a lot like the H.L. Hunley. We have spy reports from Union spies that they actually had a submarine here that was being built here. And at the end of the war, when they take over, the reports we have are that the Union seized this vessel and ended up basically turning back to its owners for scrap. But they were experimenting with all these wild technologies and kind of throwing it up against the wall to see what worked. And you know what really worked the best? The most shocking thing that worked, that was designed by Texans, were torpedoes, which we would call mines today. They were floating mines. And these guys from Lavaca that had been attacked by Union gunboats in the November of 1862 decided they were going to build some mines to help protect their waters against the Union gunboats. And they worked so well that these guys were sent on to Mobile and to Richmond and to North Carolina and all of these different places, and they built and put mines in all of those waters. And so at the end of the war, for example, when you hear the famous invasion of Mobile Bay by Admiral Farragut, and as he's going into the bay, somebody says there are torpedoes over there, mines. He says, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And of course, one of his vessels does that and is blown up and sunk. When he says, damn the torpedoes, he's damning the Texas torpedoes, because all those torpedoes were made by Texans and installed by Texans. And the arrangements, we have the arrangements under which they were made and put into the waters, and they got a specified percentage of any of the Union ships that were sunk. So it's a fascinating, kind of an untold story of the Civil War, and it's something that is kind of homegrown here and something I don't think anybody really realizes about.
That's fascinating. When I drive through Port Lavaca today, the last thing I think of is submarine building. All right, so this will be my last, I guess, official question before we move on to Q&A from the audience. A few years removed from the Civil War, could you tell us a little bit about Reconstruction, and then in 1880, the celebrity that shows up here in Galveston?
So after the Civil War is over, of course, we end up electing U.S. Grant president for 2 successive terms. And that's an amazing thing if you think about it, because at the outset of the Civil War, Grant was a sort of a disappointed and depressed store clerk in Galena, Illinois, in a store he didn't even own. And within 10 years, he is General-in-Chief of the United States Army and is President of the United States. There's no other country in the world where that kind of rise could possibly happen. But again, things go very badly wrong after the end of the Civil War, because again, what we talked about earlier, there's no negotiated transition between the end of the Confederacy and the advent of the Union government as it is restored. Nothing is negotiated, nothing is put in place to really assist with this process. And in the absence of structure, chaos develops. And into that chaos steps some very unwholesome elements, including people like the Ku Klux Klan, which Grant will have to fight during the entirety of his 2 terms in office. But at the end of Grant's terms, they'll have this election in 1876 that's a complete disaster. And, if we think our last election was contested, that was heavily contested on a number of different fronts. And it ends up being resolved in a kind of what they call a corrupt bargain, which is that they'll let one of the candidates take the presidency, but in return for that, all the Union troops will be removed from the South. And when that happens, then the elements take over in Texas and in the other places in the South, and you get the Jim Crow laws, and you get some really, really horrible things that happen as a result of that. Now, Grant is not president when that happens. He's gone. And the reason is he is sick of things up there. And after his presidency, he decides to take a trip around the world. And he literally goes around the world. He goes to Japan. He goes to Egypt. And what's interesting about that is he has a newspaper reporter around along with him who starts sending back accounts of Grant's visits to all these different kings and queens and potentates all around the world. And people read about Grant and the way he's received, and suddenly they start liking Grant more. And it's just, he gets good publicity, and it just keeps coming back, a steady stream of it. So when Grant comes back at the end of this journey in 1878, 79, he finds that unexpectedly there's a huge movement afoot for him to be named to a third term as president. And Grant says he doesn't care whether he's president or not. He really does not care. He'll do it if people want it, but he's not going to seek it for himself. But his political advisors want it. And so they say, you know, that traveling thing worked out really well for you. Let's do some more of that. So they send him out on another trip. This time Grant says, all right, I'm not going very far. I'll go to Cuba and I'll go to Mexico, because he wants to show his wife some places he's been in the Mexican War. And on the way back from Mexico, Grant says, you know, I've never been to Galveston. I'll go to Galveston. So they take off from Veracruz. Their ship almost goes down in a horrible storm, but they arrive here in Galveston in March of 1880. And Grant arrives as the biggest celebrity that ever hit Texas. And I would say he's probably the biggest celebrity who's ever hit Texas up to this point. I mean, this guy, it was be like the Pope and Elvis Presley showed up on the same day. This is big time fame. And nobody in Galveston had ever seen him in person. Everybody wanted to see him. People were on the roofs to see him. Huge parade takes him over to the Tremont Hotel, and we have probably the most famous social event in Galveston history in the Tremont House ballroom on that one night. He'll spend about a week in Texas and leave, but the interesting thing is, Grant comes to Texas in 1880. Now remember, 1865 is the end of the war. Texas is a heavily Confederate state. You would have thought that people in Texas, these ex-Confederates, would hate him, right? That's what I thought coming into the research. No, they love Grant. Everybody waits in line to shake his hand. He's a big celebrity. Everybody loves him. Partly because, again, the way he treated Robert E. Lee at the end of the war. He could have made things really difficult for Lee and his army in terms of the surrender, but he had been generous in the terms he offered. And even after the war, when forces up north wanted to indict Lee for treason and basically put him and the other people in prison, Grant stood up and said, I will not stand for this. I gave this man my word that he would be not molested in terms of the surrender, and stood up for him. So people in the South had generally a very favorable impression of Grant, and his visit here was again, probably the leading thing that ever happened in the 19th century in Galveston.
All right, so we have just a few minutes left, about 8 minutes left. I'm going to open it up to Q&A from anyone here. Does anyone have any questions?
I have one. This is about Galveston. During that blockade, because my family was here, my great aunt was born in 1861. So that meant she was just an infant. And my grandfather was 3 or 4. So I just wondered what would the effect on people that were here?
Well, to begin with, there weren't very many people here, because very early in the war, once they figured out that the Union ships could bombard the city at any time, and they did have one of those bombardments in 1861, most of the residents left, except the ones that were real Union supporters. Most of them left. So, for example, the Galveston newspaper was printed in Houston for the entire remainder of the war. Even though it said the Galveston News, it's printed in Houston. And there are very few people here in 1862 until Galveston is recaptured. And so when Galveston is recaptured, there's this question about, well, is this going to last or not? And they managed to kind of, last long enough to build the fortifications around the city. Then you do start to get some people coming back into the city. But it's not like it was before the war or like it's going to be at the end of the war. Not that kind of population. And the people that do come back have a very difficult time, because you don't have, the shops are not really open to service anything. You can't do the kind of things you would have normally done. Galveston's big thing was shipping and working on ships, things to do with vessels, transactions. You can't do any of that, so it doesn't really work out very well for these people. And there's crime is terrible. At one point in 1864, the Confederate Signal Corps officer comes down from the building where the Mod Coffee House is today, and he just walks out the door, and he's robbed by a guy with a gun, and he's shot in the leg, and they take off with $200 of money. And Lindsay, Lieutenant Lindsay, who's the name of the Signal Corps guy, says that the only thing that made him feel better about that loss was that the money was completely worthless about a year later. Anything else?
Have you heard accounts of people finding cannonballs in their houses or in their yards? Is there truth that there would be cannonballs from the battle that they were found afterwards? And if so, was it a danger?
Yes, there have been iron found all over the island from not only the Battle of Galveston, but there were several bombardments, both from the Gulf and from inside the harbor, that would have left a large quantity of iron there. And we have some examples here in the museum. I mean, the museum on the third floor, for example, of some iron that hit the Henley building. But there's a structure. I know that there's a house called the Grover House over on Market Street that still stands there today. And I remember reading the account of a guy who was a child in that house in the late 1800s. He said whenever they needed fishing weights, they would just go over to the back of that house, and you could find iron sitting all over the place there. But there are some actual examples of people finding shells on Galveston and digging them up. And we have one account where a young boy was actually trying to open one of them up and see what was in it, and it exploded, killed him. So that kind of put a kibosh on that. But again, we did the excavation on a warship called the Westfield, which was found in Galveston Bay, and excavated that. But when we did that, we found huge quantities of Civil War ordnance that had to be basically the Marine Corps had to come in and drill and safely remove the powder from that to make it safe.
What consequences did Houston's anti-secessionist states have on him politically and personally?
Well, that's an interesting subject, because if you go to, it's I think the corner of 22nd and Post Office. That's where the old Tremont Hotel used to be. It's 23rd and Post Office. That's the old Tremont Hotel. It's also a parking lot today. That was the first one. And Houston came in 1861 and was determined to give a speech to the people of Galveston about why he did not support secession and his position on it. And this was put in the paper that he was going to come and speak at the Tremont, and his friends all told him, don't do that. That is a very bad idea. People will kill you. And Houston said, I'm going to do it. And it was road over here at that time, because there wasn't actually a road over here. Got over here, went over to the balcony of the Tremont Hotel and was getting ready to go up it. And as he's getting ready to go up into the balcony, so a voice in the crowd says, let's get a rope and hang the old traitor, which, wouldn't encourage me to speak very well. I don't know about you. But Houston went up there and delivered about a 30-minute speech, which is transcribed, and we have copies of it. It's a beautiful speech. And what he said was this. He said, you may win independence for the South, but I doubt it. And he said, when you look at all the resources that are allied against you, you don't have the resources to compete with these people. But he said, you've made your decision. I stand with Texas, and I'm going to support the state. And of course, his son would actually serve in the Confederate Army. And although Houston had opposed secession, when he had been offered the opportunity by Abraham Lincoln to get the support of federal troops to try and stay in office, Houston had turned that down. And so I think that probably diminished his reputation shortly there among Texans, but in the long term, I don't know that it had any perceptible effect on his reputation.
Everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening for Galveston Unscripted at the Rosenberg Library. This episode comes from the Rosenberg Library Conversation series, where I sat down with a few historians to talk about some extremely interesting historical facts about Galveston and Texas history. I would like to personally thank the Rosenberg Library for allowing Galveston Unscripted to hold live podcast conversations in the library. If this is your first time listening to Galveston Unscripted, be sure to subscribe to the podcast. If you've listened or watched before and you enjoy the content we are putting out in audio and video, please make sure to like, subscribe, and review the podcast. Leave us a review, leave us a rating. It really helps other people find what we are doing here at Galveston Unscripted. Your rating and review helps other people find Galveston Unscripted and discover the amazing history of our little island. And be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all those social media platforms. When I drive through Port Lavaca today, the last thing I think of is submarine building.